You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and federally certified veteran-owned small business. I'm your host, Robert Bain, along with our producer, Chris Spangle. Our podcast is featured on the All Indiana Podcast Network in partnership with Wish TV. You may find Leaders and Legends at allindianapodcastnetwork.com. Thinking of starting a podcast or need to host a public meeting? Let Leaders and Legends LLC be your partner as you look for new ways to communicate your message. Please contact us at chris@leadersandlegends.net. As always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister. Our guest today, author Josh Dean. His book, The Impossible Factory, The Remarkable True Story of Kelly Johnson and the Lockheed Skunk Works, America's Innovation Machine. Mr. Dean, thank you very much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me on.
I want to start first with Kelly Johnson. Who he was, where he came from, why he's important. But when I was talking to, actually, as I mentioned a few seconds ago off the air, to my brother, who's a retired pilot, and I told him about this book, his response was, "Thank God Kelly was on our side." With that lead in, tell us a little bit about Kelly Johnson and why he had such an impact to this day.
Yeah. Well, one of the reasons, probably the main reason I wanted to write this book was because I didn't know Kelly until I discovered him in the writing of my last book, which is a crazy thing to say because I think, I'm pretty convinced now that you can make an argument that he's one of the great engineers of the 20th century and of American history. And I think I say in the book, in the same breath of Henry Ford and automobiles, you can think of Kelly Johnson and airplanes. And the main reason we don't all know him it is because most of what he did was secret during his life. And so he started right before World War II and then really built his legend during the Cold War, making planes that were secret, black projects. So when he was doing these amazing things, he just wasn't out there giving interviews. He wasn't being profiled. His job was to make great things to help the American war and intelligence machine. Not just that. He worked on some commercial projects we can talk about too, but really his job was to help us win wars, including the Cold War, which wasn't by definition a hot war, but still no less important. And the things he was making were arguably existential for the U.S. And so I learned about him. I started looking. I was like, oh, wow, he made the SR-71 Blackbird. Oh, and the P-38 and the Constellation and the U-2. Wait, the same guy did all of these planes? How do I not know who he is? And so I set out to write this book. I guess the quickest way to sum up who he was, it's a true, God, it sounds like such a cliche now, but like, self-made American, child of immigrants from Sweden, grew up in poverty, self-taught, became obsessed with airplanes in the teens, early teens, put himself through the University of Michigan, got a job at this upstart company called Lockheed and proved to be this aeronautical engineering genius. So it's a true like American success story.
You mentioned that so much of his work was secret. I love the quote you have in the book where he's asked a question and he said, well, if I could talk about it, it's already obsolete.
Yeah, that was Morley Safer on 60 Minutes. So Kelly, he's born in 1910. He retired around 65, as we all were supposed to do back before no one could afford to retire anymore. He finally gave like the definitive interview to 60 Minutes in the early 80s. So he was in his 70s at that point. And yeah, it was really by far the highest profile thing he'd ever done. And he was asked a question, and that was his answer. If I could talk about it, it's obsolete.
Brilliant. How much did the timing of his life, like if he'd been born 100 years or 50 years earlier, I could see him being an engineer for a dreadnought or some other ship or some other sort of technological marvel. How did this sort of the Kelly Johnson man meet the moment? How did he fit into the time period?
Well, he aviation was invented before him, but he really came of age when aviation became a thing. It was like it was like a fringe pursuit of like barnstormers and eccentrics, and of a handful of pilots who fought in World War One. I mean, we're talking like a literal handfuls. I think the U.S. had one plane until the 1920s, I think. So he was obsessed with Tom Swift, and he was obsessed with invention, and he would read these books at the Carnegie Library in this small town in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. And then one day saw a plane fly over the state at a fair and thought like that's amazing. That's what I want to do. And I think he became this autodidact to some extent. I mean, he obviously had an education, but he was able to pick things up really quickly. And as he described it later, we'll talk about the Skunk Works, the organization that grew up around him, but he said something like, all it really is the application of logic to very difficult problems. So if you look at the scope of the planes he designed, there's almost no through line between the P-38 and the SR-71, the fastest plane ever built. In the 1960s, it still looks like a spaceship. So you're like, how could the same person do that? And I think it's because you're right. He could have made ships. He could have made cars. Today, he'd probably work in space or he'd be in drones. It was just like, oh, okay, we need a plane that does these three things. I know how to solve those. And each time it was a new problem and you attack it in a different way. And I think that you're right. That would have applied to anything. He was just a brilliant mind who also, and this is really important to his legacy, if he had been just a genius engineer, that's good enough. But he also built an organization that enabled his genius to again and again create more incredible machines to solve problems. And so all the time we see brilliant people do one thing and then they, flame out or they get rich and quit. Yeah, there's like lots of reasons they only have one big hit. Kelly just did it over and over again because he built a machine around himself too.
What do you think it would be like if Kelly Johnson and Elon Musk sat down for a couple hours?
I often say, Elon is
Because that's who I kept thinking of when I was reading the book. I mean, politics aside, just I hate to say mad scientists, don't tell me no, we can fix it, we can make it happen. And yeah, we can do it in 8 months, even though you gave us a year, and let's experiment. And what's the next big thing? And I mean, I'm sure there are other examples, but Musk is the one who comes to mind. Am I far off?
I don't think so. Is like a mix between Kelly and Howard Hughes. Howard Hughes plays a role in this book too because he was one of the early customers of Lockheed, and Kelly, I would describe it as, had to put up with him. I mean, obviously, Hughes was a great customer, and the Constellation was, the most important early commercial project in Lockheed's history, which was a twin engine, well, actually a 4-engine cross country commercial jet with a pressurized commercial plane with a pressurized cabin. Basically, it helped bring commercial air travel to the masses. And Hughes, but Hughes was also a nut, and he hung around the office in the hangars, and he asked Kelly and the other engineers to make experimental stuff for him, and then he would take the controls himself, and it drove Kelly crazy. Elon's got that spirit in him too, which is sort of like he definitely wants to push the envelope. I think he's his own worst enemy sometimes, and he's probably doesn't have any self-discipline, but there's no question he's got a big brain and a lot of ambition, and I think that's what Kelly did too. Kelly was, however, a very careful, methodical, he did not ever say a word out of line. He did everything very much within his own system, like by the books, in the sense he would never have gone out and I think some of the things Elon does would have horrified him, but I think that you're right that the kind of, why is it impossible? Don't tell me it's impossible. Like, that's the spirit.
You're listening to the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guest is author Josh Dean. We are discussing his book, The Impossible Factory, the remarkable true story of Kelly Johnson and the Lockheed Skunk Works, America's innovation machine. Before the Skunk Works, way before, Kelly Johnson was making his mark as America.
Your day moves fast. Your news should too. That's why there's a new and improved Wish TV app, bringing you more local news, breaking alerts, live streaming, weather forecasts, radar, and Indiana sports, all in one place. Customize your news feed to see the stories that matter most to you and get the information you need when you need it. Download the new and improved Wish TV app today on iOS or Android and take News 8 with you everywhere.
Went to war as America fought World War II. What role did Kelly Johnson and his team, because it was more than just him, but staying with Mr. Johnson, what role did they play during World War II?
So Kelly was born in 1910. So when the war breaks out in the late 30s, he's in his late 20s. He's a very young engineer. And I should, before I get to the war, there's one short anecdote that I need to tell because it's relevant. When Kelly literally showed up on the doorstep at Lockheed and kind of demanded a job or basically said, I don't have anywhere else to go. You should hire me. They didn't have a job because the depression was going on. And they said, go back to Michigan, get your master's, and then come bug us the next year. So what did he do? He went back to Michigan. He got his master's. But while he was there, he heard about this plane that Lockheed was designing called the Electra. It was a twin engine. They were basically banking their future on it. They were a scrappy upstart. They were short on cash. They needed a hit. They couldn't afford a failure. And so here's Kelly, graduate student, and he looks at this plane and says, it's great, but it's not going to fly. It's unstable. So when he gets hired at Lockheed, I don't know if it's one of the first things he did. It's certainly maybe the first momentous thing he did as he marched into his boss's office as a 23 or 4 or 5-year-old tool designer. And he was like, this plane is unstable. It's not going to fly. And, you can imagine how most bosses would react to that. They'd be like, get the hell out of my office. Who are you? You're just some punk that we hired to make tools. But he was empowered by these brilliant leaders who trusted that he was as smart as he seemed to be. And they said, okay, prove it. Go back to the wind tunnel, figure out, because telling us it's not going to fly is not actually that helpful. You have to tell us how to fix it too, right?
Right.
Which I think is great advice for anybody. If you're going to go to your boss and say your boss is wrong, then you better have evidence for why and tell him how to do his job better. Like Kelly wasn't trying to get his boss fired. He was just like, this plane could crash. Like, let's make it better. And I tell that story because when World War II breaks out, America's not yet in the war, but the British Air Corps show up in America basically saying, these U-boats are killing us. We need, can we use air power to help neutralize this? And so they go around and talk to all the companies, and Lockheed actually didn't even get a meeting, I don't think, but they just happened to say, talk to us too. And a delegation is chosen to work on a design, and they modify one of their own planes, and Electra actually turn it into this thing called the Hudson Bomber. They take the Queen Mary over to England. They present their modified design to the British command, and they're like, it's not quite right. And so what does Kelly do? Over 72 hours in his hotel room without showering or sleeping, he redesigns the airplane from nose to tail, basically, presents it again to the British command. And this time they're like, oh yeah, this is great. This is what we want. And then one of them pulls his boss aside and says, do you really trust this kid? And the boss is like, absolutely. This was he did this, right? And there's like, okay, it's only the war, the free world is all that's at stake here. So, and I think it's a very telling anecdote because he first did it with this commercial plane, then it proved himself again on the Hudson. And then very quickly, when the U.S. gets into war, the American wasn't yet the Air Force, but what would become the Air Force realized our planes are inferior to what they're flying in Europe and in Japan. We need something better. Kelly designs the P-38, which, I think it's between that and the Blackbird of what aviation nuts think is the most beautiful or amazing design he ever did. If for those who don't know it, it has these twin booms. So it had a fuselage, but then instead of having wings with engines on it, it's actually got engines attached to these twin booms. So it actually looks like 3 fuselages with a plane. It's very iconoclastic looking. But it was a brilliant design, and it was one of the first planes that had counter-rotating propellers. So before that, all the fighters had propellers that turned in one direction. And what happens is under stress, apparently, this is what I'm told, pilots would veer in the direction that the propellers turn because that's where the plane was fastest and most stable. So in a dogfight, it made pilots pretty predictable. It's not the only reason Kelly did it, but the P-38 had propellers that turned in opposite directions. So it was as good going left as it was going right. And that plane, I could have written a book about that plane. Most famously, it kicked ass in dogfights, but most famously, a squadron of them flew 50 feet over the Pacific for hours in order to rendezvous with Admiral Yamamoto's he was transiting from one base to another, and we got intelligence of where he was going to be. And the Japanese are nothing if not punctual. So they're like, Yamamoto is going to be over this island at a specific time. They picked P-38s because they could take a beating and keep on ticking. They were also, they could fly long, they could fly low, and only one American plane was lost. They shot down Yamamoto, helped turn the war on the Pacific. So Kelly helps the British with the Hudson, helps the US with the P-38. And then this just becomes like, by the time he's in his early 30s, he's considered to be already one of the best military aviation designers around.
First, I should mention my friend, Roger Harvey, who listens to the podcast occasionally. It's his father, as an ad exec, who came up with the phrase, "It takes a licking and keeps on ticking."
Oh, really?
Yes.
Well, that's the P-38 and the Hudson, by the way. Both.
Oh, and the P-38's the greatest. It's the sweetest looking plane of the war by
So cool.
far. It's gorgeous. And the third thing I'll say is one of my favorite pieces of, and when I was reading this part of your book, I was wondering if you're going to mention it. Did you ever happen to know what the code was? So when the Americans, what was the code for the American pilots to send back to base to affirm their mission was a success?
No, I don't know.
Ding dong, the witch is dead. And this is coming just 4 years after The Wizard of Oz, or 5 years after The Wizard of Oz hit theaters. The P-38 is remarkable, but did that make Kelly Johnson? In other words, was that level of success by pilots, by the federal government, by the Allies? Did that put him on the place that made his bones, for lack of a better term?
I think it made Lockheed, and within Lockheed it made him, but I'm not sure he's known until what comes next. I assume we'll talk about the P-80 and the birth of the Skunk Works next. I think what it did was, wow, this Lockheed company. And again, I keep saying scrappy upstart. Like, you can think of them as like all of these aviation companies were like Silicon Valley tech startups at that time. Aviation was new. Every plane was a new experiment, all different kinds of starting to experiment with propulsion. And so Lockheed, with these two successes, and then the Constellation comes right behind them, is suddenly like, whatever those guys are doing, it's right. And internally, it's because of Kelly. And I think within the industry, obviously, it was recognized that Kelly and his boss, Hal Hibbard, who was also, I think, a brilliant engineer, but probably maybe most brilliant for not being threatened by this young kid who shows up and is basically like, I think it was Hall who coined the phrase that Kelly could see air. He was just like, this kid is special. Like, I'm a brilliant engineer, but the most brilliant thing I can do is get out of this kid's way, or at least like help him be great. And so I think, it certainly burnished his legend within Lockheed. And then what happens after that, I think, is what makes him at least a brand within defense.
You led me right to, it was a question I was going to ask later, but I'm going to ask it now instead. The importance of having mentors to Kelly Johnson's career. You just said brilliant engineers who weren't threatened, who recognized the genius. Who were some of the men and women? I know that's a topic we're going to get to later, but some of the men who said, look, this guy is different.
Well, really, his first two bosses, they deserve a tremendous amount of credit. And when I do, like, the main talk I give on the book, one of my early slides is like, there's no Kelly Johnson without Hal Hibbard, who was the head of engineering at Lockheed, and then Robert Gross, who was the president, founder of Lockheed. He bought it out of bankruptcy during the Depression, or right before, for $40,000, I think, that he'd raised from investors. It was not considered to be a good investment, by the way. Airplane companies were not. Again, it was like experimental tech, basically. It's like, good luck.
And to the point you said,
money.
forgive me, to the point you said, I'm sorry, a few minutes ago, there were all these startup planes, Curtiss and all the Boeing and all the Douglas, and the list goes on, but another, probably I would guess, dozen or more companies we've never heard of because they lasted a couple of years in the 20s and 30s.
Exactly. And the valley where the San Fernando Valley of LA, which is where Lockheed was based, until the 90s, where Kelly shows up, that was basically Silicon Valley. They were all yet, the famous story of Apple being started in a garage. A lot of these companies were started in garages. They were just like tinkers and home built kits. And so Kelly's first two bosses, so Robert Gross recognizes there's some value in the designs that were coming out of the original Lockheed, which had a different spelling. It was two Scottish brothers who originally founded it. It was Loughead. And I think they correctly realized, like, no one's going to be able to spell that. We'll just go, it's pronounced Lockheed. Let's just do Lockkev. And Gross starts the company, hires Hall Hibbert, and Hall hires Kelly, and then recognizes, like, the best thing I can do is get out of his way. So I think without those guys, there's no Kelly.
Was it important then, later on in Kelly Johnson's career, to be the mentor and not the mentee?
Definitely. And I think, I suspect we'll talk about some of Kelly's management philosophies. And while he was a big personality, he did to some degree, run his group like a, dictatorship. He was very much the boss and the buck stopped there. He also believed very much in empowering brilliant people. I mean, he was a demanding boss and a taskmaster. However, if you were good at your job and did the things that you claimed to be good at well, then he stayed out of your way. In fact, I think what he would say would be, I don't want to get involved in your business because I put you in charge of engines or airframes or landing gear because I think you're the best person we have to do that. Only come to me when there's a problem or you need budget and so I think he believed very much, and he was not a micromanager. He was not, he was sort of like, here's your job, go and do your job. And then later in his career, when he was getting old and the board, like I said, at 65, you basically had to retire back then. But also he saw the writing on the wall, and we can get to this too. He recognized that maybe he was no longer the best person to represent the Skunk Works in a 1970s and 80s world that was
Mhm.
changing and computers are coming online. So he handpicked his successor and then empowered that person, Ben Rich, to take it to the next generation. And so Kelly would definitely identify people that he believed in and trusted and let them thrive. And there's all kinds of engineers through his tenure at the Skunk Works who were brilliant and I think loved their jobs because they got to do these incredible things and they were trusted by him.
And I would assume that Lockheed became sort of I want to go work for Kelly Johnson, for all
I
these
have
engineers and aeronautics people coming out of college or coming out of the military. Like, it became a destination because of him.
I have no doubt that is true. That would have been if not the top, one of the top engineering jobs in America, and that you would know, even though you don't necessarily know what they're working on, it's cool, and that you're going to get to do amazing things, and that they just worked at a pace that was, I'm not sure it's even possible today, but it was just like, you're not going to spend 10 years drafting and making prototypes and waiting to see your creation come to life. Like they're making planes that were flying 6 months later.
And this is one of my favorite parts of your book. You describe some slide rules and
Graph
blueprints
paper.
and all these draft paper. And that's, to me, it just amplifies the genius and the hard work.
Well, if you take the SR-71, I mean, probably, you mentioned the P-38. I think a lot of plane fans love that plane the most, but the SR-71 is the most famous thing. Well, originally the A-12, let's just call it the Blackbird, which it's definitely the design. Like, people had that poster on their walls and they didn't know anything about it. It just looked so cool. It was like, I had pictures of Ferraris on my walls when I was in high school. A lot of people had the Blackbird because it's sexy. It was fast. It flew Mach 3.2 at 85,000 feet. It just exploded what we would consider to be the boundaries of physics, what was possible in the air. And it was designed literally with slide rules and graph paper. They didn't have computers. And so it just shows you that, when you have certain people who are, I think, it's fair to, we overuse the term genius, but when someone is a genius and isn't just a genius because it's their brain, they know how to find the other people who can work with them and around them. And the Skunk Works, the group that Kelly built to do these things, was just staffed by these incredible, brilliant minds who often were a little weird or might be difficult to work with in their own way, but they were like the best material specialist or the best aerodynamicist around.
You are listening to the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guest is Josh Dean. We're discussing his book, fabulous book, even for people like me who aren't a gearhead, who isn't a gearhead, excuse me. You can understand it because it's written so well. The book is The Impossible Factory, the remarkable true story of Kelly Johnson and the Lockheed Skunk Works, America's innovation machine. Before I ask the next question, let me ask you, is there a particular Hoosier, leader, and or legend you admire most?
My dad, who actually passed away recently, is a Hoosier. So I have
Oh, God
Hoosier
love him.
blood. I have Hoosier blood in me. He was born in Anderson and grew up in Indianapolis. And I used to spend all of my Thanksgivings in Indianapolis until my grandmother died because she had a house in North Indianapolis. So yeah, I guess that would make me a quarter Hoosier.
We've talked about several of the planes. P-38, the end of the war, the end of World War II, was certainly the catalyst for the beginning of the jet age, especially military, but eventually civilian. How did Kelly Johnson help inaugurate America's jet age?
Similar to, I was talking earlier about how people would come to him into Lockheed with a specific problem. So he had made the P-38, which really helped air superiority on both fronts. He'd done the Hudson, which helped neutralize the U-boats for the British, and then was modified into a very successful bomber that did all kinds of things. Kelly's at an air base one day, and the head of the Army Air Corps pulls him aside and says, "The Germans have a jet. If we don't have a jet, we could be in trouble. Like if they beat it, like that's a game changing evolution in air combat. What can we do about it?" And Kelly again, and these stories all sound ridiculous except they're true. He says to this guy, "Okay, I'll make you a jet and I'll have it ready in 6 months." And apparently he like scrawled a contract basically on a piece of paper, just promising that he would do it. And then he went back to California and told his boss. Again, he goes, flies back to Burbank, walks into Hall and Gross's office. I think they were together in probably Gross's office, and says, "Okay, I promised the Air Corps that I would make a jet in 6 months." And they were like, "Excuse me?" But then, okay, all right. So yeah, you've proven yourself before, and it's a really important moment in his career because they're making P-38s and Hudsons as fast as they can. Like Lockheed can't suddenly pivot to jets because that doesn't mean the war stops just because we're trying to develop a new technology to catch up with the Germans. So what they say to Kelly is, "Okay, you'll get your budget. You can pick the people that you want to work on this, but you cannot get in the way of this company. You go find your own space. You find your own furniture, literally, and you pick a small enough team that it doesn't hurt Lockheed. But if you can pick the smartest people, but it has to be a small team." He gets 35 engineers and I think 43 machinists. They build desks out of engine boxes. They put up a circus tent over a parking lot. And in 143 days, they developed the P-80, America's first jet fighter, and ahead of time. So he said he would do it in 6 months. He did it in 143 days. And that becomes the Skunk Works. It even gets the nickname Skunk Works during that period, but that is not just the first fighter developed in 104 jet fighter developed in 143 days. It's the idea that a company can have a company inside of itself that takes really big swings, that is given a great degree of autonomy in its own budget, but it has one very strong leader who's allowed to just, he doesn't have to go to his boss every day and brief him on what he's doing. He doesn't have to ask for more money every week. There's not like reviews and presentations. It's just like, "Okay, Kelly, go and do it." And he did it. And I think that's a thing that he would repeat over and over again for the rest of his career.
Please expand a little bit on the name Skunk Works, how it came about.
Yeah, it's funny because I get asked about this a lot. A lot of companies in tech they literally have a division that they call like it's our Skunk Works, and I think a lot of them don't know what it means. If they know that it came from Lockheed, and a lot of them do, they don't know why it was called the Skunk Works or what that even means. And what they mean is they have something that is similar to what I described, this kind of unit that takes big swings. It's like this is our innovation lab and it has its own rules. But the reason it's called that is because when they were in that, circus tent, it eventually got some walls and it became, just a makeshift factory. I can't imagine how crude it was, but like, who cares? The point was we got to make a jet and we got to make it fast. So what if you don't have air conditioning? There's a war going on. There was only one telephone for security reasons. And so whoever was nearest the phone would pick it up, and often it would be like the Pentagon or somebody's wife. Like you just never knew who it was. And Kelly was like, "You can't say who we are, so just say whatever." And this one guy, Irv Culver, who's one of his engineers, started answering the phone and saying Skunk Works, SKONK. inside man Culver speaking. And the joke was there was a plastics factory across the railroad tracks, and like smelly air was constantly going in there, so it just stunk. And in the Lil Abner cartoon by Al Cap, there was a like, I mean, it probably wasn't alcohol in a comic strip, but essentially a moonshine factory out in the woods called the Skunk Works, where they made this concoction with like skunk tails and old shoes, and it just was like a stinky, smelly beverage that they made in the woods in the Labner. And for whatever reason, this guy decided to start saying it. Kelly hated it, but it stuck. And they all started calling it the Skunk Works, Skunk. It became well known enough that Al Cap himself threatened to sue them and said, wait a second, you can't call it that. That's like, so they changed it from skunk to skunk and eventually trademarked it and got a logo in it. And to this day, it's a division of Lockheed called the Skunk Works.
Your book does a terrific job, you do, in writing your book about how the Skunk Works tried to be replicated by other companies. How successful were other companies? Because you had Boeing and McDonnell Douglas and so on and so forth, strong technological aviation companies and beyond. Were they successful in their version of it, or did they lack a Kelly Johnson?
Yeah, I'm not sure there's an analog in aviation that's truly in the same. Like there were other brilliant designers, and certainly Lockheed is far from the only American aircraft manufacturer that's made amazing planes. Like they've made a lot of them, but there were others. But I don't think there's a successful comparison in terms of like a group inside one of those companies that just took like everybody started having their own advanced development. But I think where the most interesting kind of follow-ons are once like Silicon Valley starts up, and he's like, the most famous example I can remember is that apparently Steve Jobs, when he was working on the Macintosh, toured the Skunk Works and actually had grown up inspired by Kelly Johnson and decided like that's the model for how we should be doing like home computing. And then when he leaves Apple for a while and starts Next, and then when he founds Pixar, even Pixar, this animation company, apparently the way that it's like architected is inspired by one of the Skunk Works ideals is you kind of literally take down the walls between departments, that the engineers need to be sitting next to the machinist, because like if those guys can't build it, they need to be able to turn around and say like, this isn't working. And then they fix it together in 5 minutes. And apparently when Jobs designed Pixar, he like wanted the various departments, like, so like where he would put the bathrooms, and he's trying to encourage interaction between departments, because what happens in all companies is everybody gets siloed. You often work in literally a complex or a building that's so far away from the people downstream of you, and that maybe occasionally you have meetings or you send emails around. But when you're all together and you're talking all the time, that's how things get built really quickly. Steve Jobs is gone. I can't ask him how much he was inspired by, but I've heard that it's true. I do think that when I do like a business version of this, people ask me why there aren't more successful Skunk Works around. And I think the real answer is it's very hard politically to empower someone in the way that he's very threatening to the people above him. So I think, you have to be a confident enough leader to say like, this person over here deserves autonomy and I don't need to be all up in his business, and I'm going to approve his budgets and I'm not going to ask questions, because like he's going to surpass you or maybe get you fired, or what if he makes a mistake? So most businesses are pretty conservative, and these maverick types tend to go and need to start their own companies because it's pretty hard inside of an organization to be a Kelly Johnson, I think.
Well, you're mentioning of Kelly Johnson and how he interacted with his bosses. I love how you detail in the book how Kelly Johnson interacted with the Pentagon and the federal government and the White House.
Yeah, no different than the way he interacted with his bosses, which was basically like, I'll do what you want, but stay out of my way. And you can imagine.
I'm not giving you a report every month, and don't come here. And they still did. The military, the brass came to the warehouse or the Skunk Works or whatever. But he's like, you're not getting, quarterly reports from me.
No, and like almost literally, like when he would, and I should say that after the P-80, and then he does the F-104, which is kind of his next brilliant plane. The two most famous things he would do under the Skunk Works were the U-2 and the SR-71. Those were both spy planes. So the client in those cases was the CIA and not the DoD, and that was a pretty important distinction. Eisenhower chose the CIA to oversee those because he didn't want to start a war. He felt it was important for civilian pilots to be flying civilian planes over enemy territory, which I think is smart and the right move. And so they had to create cover stories, but also meant that Kelly was working for the CIA and not the DoD. And I think that was very important, even today, but way more so then. Less bureaucracy, much less oversight, a lot more secrecy versus like committees and meetings and paperwork. And like the Pentagon will just bury you in paperwork and meetings, I think. And at the end of his career, when Kelly had to deal with the Air Force and the Pentagon more and more, it slowly drove him crazy. But the CIA was the kind of boss he wanted, which was like, got it. I hear what you want. I'm going to do it. It's going to be done. And let's take the U-2, for instance. Eisenhower tells his aides that he needs a way to spy inside the Soviet Union, like worried that they're developing advanced bombers and their ICBMs are ahead of ours. But we don't have any spies in Russia. How do we see that? Well, we need to fly over it and take pictures. They had created this need for something that can fly 70,000 feet higher than the missiles and can take pictures on the ground that are like usable intelligence. And Kelly's like, no problem. I can do it. And I'll do it in 8 months. And so the CIA is like, okay, well, here's the black funds. And because they're black funds, there aren't a lot of strings attached because not many people know that you even have this money. And you're going to build it in such secrecy that no one's actually going to know that you're doing it, even inside the government. And it would come out later that RFPs would go out for something Kelly had already made because the CIA and he were the only ones that knew it. And when it came time to fly them, they had to like go to the Air Force and say, like, we need some of your best pilots, but we need to decommit. They need to leave the service, and of course, we'll honor their rank when they come back, but they're going to become civilian pilots, and they're going to fly this thing that we're not allowed to tell them about. And so it exists in this nether region of like almost impossible to have bureaucracy, but that's what Kelly demands. He's just like, I can't do what you want me to do if every week I have to sit down in a room full of generals and explain myself. And like, I'm not going to do a PowerPoint presentation. Well, there was no PowerPoint. I'm not going to like stand up and perform for you. Yeah, of course. We'll have benchmarks. I'll send you status reports. And if I'm behind, then you can yell at me. But what I don't want is like a bunch of guys in suits walking around bugging my engineers. And it works. And it's why he's able to do what he did. I mean, on the Blackbird program, which was so far and beyond like exponential leaps in every possible way from the U-2, he did get behind schedule. And then they did send people to bug him, but he hated it. But in that circumstance, he was like, you know what? I told you it would be ready and it's not ready. So it's my fault, So I think his point was very much like, as long as I give you what you said you wanted and I do it on time and I do it on budget, then you shouldn't need to bother me at all. And I think it really worked.
I love the F-104 Starfighter. It's another beautiful plane. I kind of want to move on to the U-2, but some of the planes we've talked about, P-38, is it the F-80? It just went out of my head.
Yeah. F-80. It was, I call it P-80 because that
P-80.
the prototype was done. The F-80 was the production model.
Yeah. Pursuit wasn't the P for Pursuit. I forget.
Well, first prototype and then Pursuit later. But yeah, it's F-80 is the fighter version that went to the front.
Then the F-104, which is basically a rocket with wings on it.
Its nickname was Missile with a Man in it.
Then U-2, which is famous for Francis Gary Powers and also its service during the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Yep.
Then the SR-71. From which plane to which plane was the greatest leap in technology? The hardest for Kelly and the Skunk Works engineers and everybody involved to create?
I mean, there's no question it's U-2 to Blackbird, and the first Blackbird was the CIA version was known as the A-12. It becomes the SR-71 when they build a version but that's the version most people know, the two-seater for the Air Force. But the original one was the A-12. So that's definitely the biggest leap. I mean, all of them are, the F-104 was the first Mach 2 plane, and, just quickly touch on that story was like, I just said earlier how Kelly always described like, it's the application of logic to very complicated problems. He went to Korea. He asked the pilots, "What do you need?" And they said, "Well, the MiG is killing us. We need speed and we need climb." So he's like, "All right, I'll build you a fast plane. So he builds the F-104, which, pilots love, but also don't think is the easiest plane to fly. And when it goes to Europe into the Allied hands, it crashes a lot because they try and put too much gear on it. But yeah, missile with a man in it. It has these tiny little wings and a long silver missile-like fuselage. But that long fuselage becomes important. It's sort of what inspires the U-2. The U-2, so when Eisenhower needs to overfly the Soviet Union higher than the missiles, Kelly's like, okay, how are we going to do that? Well, it needs to be able to fly a really long way. So it's going to have to carry quite a bit of fuel. But to get that high, it's going to have to be super light. It essentially has to be a glider. So he builds this plane with these huge long wings, and they're cutting weight wherever they can. And he's like, I don't think it can have landing gear. We got to save the weight. So they put these, what they called pogos on the wings, and it would take off and it would drop the landing gear. So then the pilot had to come down and land it on like bicycle tires, essentially. But what happens with Francis Gary Powers on May Day 1960, eventually the Russians were constantly iterating their air defenses, and the missiles are going higher and higher, and it's only a matter of time until one gets hit. And in fact, May Day 1960, Gary Powers is hit. He's knocked out of the sky, and he's held prisoner for over a year in Russia. Kelly saw that coming, and to be honest, so did the White House and the CIA. And they said, what's next? And so even before the U-2 is shot down, he's working on the project that is called Oxcart. It would become the A-12 Blackbird. And it was like, to say it's an evolutionary leap, I mean, it was multiple leaps. It was exponentially more complicated. He had to redesign everything. And when I say everything, the fuel, every piece of that airplane, it had some of the first integrated stealth. It was built out of titanium, the first plane built out of titanium. And I love this story. The US didn't make enough titanium, or at least at the quality required to build this plane. But you know who did? The Soviet Union. So the CIA, and this is a CIA success story, not a Lockheed success story. The CIA is like, all right, we'll get you the titanium. And they set up a series of front companies, and they bought titanium from the Soviet Union that was funneled to the Skunk Works to build a plane that was supposed to overfly the Soviet Union and take pictures. And it's an incredible story of like a different kind of American ingenuity about how we're like, all right, fine, we'll go and get it from our enemies because we can't, we can't get a factory up and going quickly enough. But it's like the tools had to be made out of different materials. They had to like change the water supply in the factories because they realized that chlorine was caused. It was like every piece of that plane was new. And it looks like if we held up if you looked at a picture today and you were asking somebody who didn't know anything about planes, they would think it was from the future today in 2026.
It is ominous.
It
That would be
looks
the
like
word I would use.
Yeah, like a snake, a cobra, I don't know what.
Well, I think it's interesting. And I chuckled when I got to this part in the book, and you mentioned it a few minutes ago, how Eisenhower, of all people, understood the Pentagon bureaucracy and said, we don't want any part of that. And I would imagine the Lockheed people must have been so relieved.
So relieved. Yeah, because they worked with the Air Force. I mean, they obviously loved working with pilots and making things for the American war effort, but they just knew what that bureaucracy was like. They're like, we can't ever do this on this time scale that we need to because they just can't move that fast.
And if I can't bend the bureaucracy, nobody can.
Yeah, exactly. A very famous general.
You are listening to the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guest, author Josh Dean. We are discussing his book, The Impossible Factory, the remarkable true story of Kelly Johnson and the Lockheed Skunk Works, America's innovation machine. It's a wonderful journey through the Cold War, which is one of my favorite periods of history. We've talked so much, deservedly so, about Kelly Johnson and the Skunk Works successes. Is there a failure or an unsolved problem you'd like to talk about for a few minutes?
I mean, I actually had a few chapters on failures, and then I realized there were so many successes. It wasn't going to have enough pages to, it's like, but not everyone succeeds all the time. And I think it is an important lesson. Someone asked me this question at a talk the other day, and I'm glad you did, because it's not like Kelly didn't have failures. I think every program had failures, but a big part of his philosophy and management style was we will fail a lot of times on the way to success, but that's how we get better. Like we obviously by the time we put a pilot in the seat and we take off, we want to make sure it's not going to crash. Like that's very important to me. And that's why Kelly was often the flight test engineer on all of his planes except the Blackbird, which was like, I'll put my money where my mouth is. I'm going to go up there with you. But I think within those programs, they would like try things that didn't work and they move on to another thing. And it was never like, okay, let's get a committee together and everybody submit ideas and let's do studies. It was more like, okay, what's the next best idea? Because that didn't work. And this happened with like on the way to the A-12, he decides what about a liquid hydrogen powered plane? I mean, they even toyed with like a nuclear powered plane, I think in some thought experiments, but they actually went down the road of trying to make a liquid hydrogen powered plane and even studied how to handle it, how to transport it. Like he sent Ben Rich, his eventual successor, on a tour around of America under a cover story to meet with all these hydrogen producers to figure out like, okay, how would we get it? Where would we store it? Is it safe to put into planes? But what they realized ultimately was one, the plane was going to have to be way too big. It just wasn't practical. And then two, it would require so much liquid hydrogen that basically all of the supply on the West Coast of the United States would have to be allocated to this program. And Kelly, and he did this a couple times. He just called, I think the Navy was the client in that case, just called them up and was like, it's not going to work. Here's your money back. And this is something he does over and over again, which is, I think when I talk to corporations, the executives can't believe it. He would like return money. Like he was like, sorry,
To
I
the
can't do
government.
it. Yeah, to the government. When he built the U-2, it came in so under budget. He built them like 6 extra planes just because, I mean, like, can you imagine that? A company not just being like, "That's some extra profit for us." He was like, "No, no. This was the budget. I came in under budget. I'm either gonna give it back to you or I'm gonna give you more planes." So in that case, he was like, "Sorry, it didn't work." The other sort of colorful example is that he tried to build a vertical takeoff and landing plane, and this was like an RFP program because I think Corvair eventually did. Someone did make one that worked, and it was called the XFV1, and really ridiculous looking thing. But it worked, except that they couldn't figure out how to land it once it went back to vertical. And so Kelly again, he ends up writing the Pentagon and just saying like, I can't safely put pilots in this thing. I'm gonna have to abandon the program. And then late in life, when he was doing that 60 Minutes interview, I think, or one of his late interviews, he's like, I actually did later figure out how to fix that. He's like, what I would have done is I would have put a rope on the end of it so that the pilot could get into a hover at a safe height, and then some like the ground crew would pull it down. Because what happened was the pilot, as you can imagine, sitting like this, they can't see the ground behind them. Like
Right.
imagine trying to land with no vision.
Well,
Uh,
would I guess, it begs the question, what would he have thought of Elon Musk retrieving rockets?
would love it, I think, probably. Like I think he's a practical guy, if not, I love
Like,
those.
show me. I wanna know. I could see him nerding out, like, "How are you doing this? I wanna
Yeah,
know how you're doing
exactly.
this."
Like would love to, yeah. And I think that was the spirit of no waste. Like if we can be efficient, he wasn't like, again, it's impossible to think of this today that in the military industrial complex, these contractors are so bloated and they make massive profits and they're never going to return a penny to the government.
Yeah, most of the time, it's the government who's demanding the money come back, not as a gift.
Yeah, not a
Uh,
gift. But
how
also,
much?
well, I was gonna say, like, also those days, it was so early that Kelly was receiving like sacks of cash essentially at his home to get programs going. So very different period.
A lot of what is happening with the Skunk Works and Kelly Johnson is going on in parallel with the massive investment in the United States space program. Was there any cross-pollination?
Well, yeah, the liquid hydrogen that I just mentioned to you. So when they abandoned that program, it was not a lost cause because what they learned about storage and handling of liquid hydrogen was actually directly handed over to the space program, and I think very instrumental in those early missions. Also, the U-2 was the first plane that required a pilot in a pressurized suit with oxygen. So the company that made the suits for the pilots in the U-2 and then the Blackbirds, David Clark Company, I believe it's called,
Mhm.
went on to make the suits for the astronauts. So like a lot of these were like early technologies that were directly applicable to the space program.
We have a few more minutes with author Justine, author of The Impossible Factory. You mentioned a word a few minutes ago, and it's kind of a nice way to perhaps end the podcast before we get to the 5 questions we ask all of our guests, and that is stealth. How was Kelly Johnson involved in the development of stealth technology, and how soon, how much earlier before like the F-117 or the B-2, B-2
yeah.
were introduced, had American engineers and scientists discovered this sort of stealth technology?
So it started experiments on stealth of the Skunk Works started on the U-2 actually, because it was always a race to go as long, continue to fly as long as you can without getting shot down. And there's a couple ways to do that. You can go higher, you can fly faster, or you can try not to get spotted. Because if the radars can't see you, then the missiles can't shoot you down. So they started doing experiments on the U-2. These really elaborate. They were like tying beads on strings and making the U-2s very heavy and impossible to fly. And then when the Blackbird is developed, it actually has stealth built into it. So some of the angles, some of the paints, there was apparently a chemical that they were injecting into the exhaust that was like supposed to help counteract reflectivity. Um, but it was just, incremental steps. So that was lowering the radar cross section, but none of it was making a plane invisible. And that's really ultimately what the Air Force or the Pentagon started to ask for, which was like, could you make an invisible plane like Wonder Woman? And so Kelly's been experimenting with it, but he has his doubts. He's like, there's only so many things I can do. But when he turns this Skunk Works over to Ben Rich, his handpicked successor, there's a pretty urgent RFP from the Pentagon, a call for a plane with a truly tiny radar cross section. Like, can it be almost invisible? And Kelly thinks it's basically impossible, at least based on the technology available at that time. But
What year?
I don't know the exact year, but we're talking mid 1970s.
Okay.
So I think 77 is when the first prototype flew. And then I think the first production model was 81. Of course, then it doesn't fly in combat until 91. Well, actually, no, Panama, 80.
Oh yeah, that's right. That's right.
But, interesting, again, reminder of that titanium story. So there is an engineer working for Ben Rich, the successor to Kelly at the Skunk Works. Kelly's still around. He's a mentor. He's a advisor. He comes in and works 10 hours a week or whatever. And Ben relies on him a lot. But one of Ben's guys finds a paper written by a Russian mathematician. It was never classified. It's unclear if the Russians didn't recognize its importance or it just slipped through the cracks. But basically what it does is it allows this engineer, Dennis Oberholzer was his name, to use math to calculate RCS and to start playing around with shapes. And essentially what he realizes is that if you use facets, so if you could think of a prism versus a mirror, you look at it, your reflection comes back at you looking exactly like you do. A prism, you shine light at it and the light bounces back in all these other directions. It was like, if you could apply that to an airplane, then that will happen to radar. The radar will hit it and it will scatter all over the place and almost none of it will make it back to its source. But of course, Kelly's like, oh, that's helpful. How can you make an airplane like a prism? But computers have come online. So they're starting to be able to do very primitive computer modeling. And more importantly, fly-by-wire is coming online. So they design the prototype Have Blue of what becomes the F-117. It's this, anyone who knows aviation has seen it. It's like the most unaerodynamic looking thing. Kelly looked at it and was like, that thing is never going to fly. He called it the hopeless diamond because he was like, and here's a good example of how Kelly recognized his time was coming. I'm no longer the guy to lead this place because I don't understand computers. Like I'm not just going to learn them now. Like I didn't believe in this shape. And then sure enough, Ben Rich's Skunk Works builds the stealth fighter, the F-117 Nighthawk prototype known as Have Blue. And they go out, I think they're head to head against, oh God, is it Northrop?
That sounds right.
They're basically
Yeah.
in a showdown, like who gets the contract. And they have a test out in the desert, whose plane has the smallest radar cross section. And there's this incredible scene at the start of, by the way, Ben Rich's book about the Skunk Works, also great. So if you're looking for a follow-on read, it's very colorful. It's more about his experience there. But I think he opens the book with it, that they bring these Marines out, radar operators, and they don't tell them what they're testing for. And Ben knows, and he's looking outside and he sees the F-117 come over, and it doesn't show up at all on the radar, basically. And then finally, they're like, "Oh, we got it. Here it comes." But it's like the T-33. It's the trainer that's coming
Mhm.
over. They completely missed the Nighthawk because it basically was invisible. Lockheed wins the contract in a rout, and then they go on to build the F-117, which decimated Iraq's command and control in the opening nights of the 1991 Gulf War. And I included it in my book. It's the last section of my book because I felt like this is the last program that reminds me of the Skunk Works that Kelly built. He put in place a system and a guy who could do it again. But then by the time the F-117 program comes, it's like it's a different world. The Pentagon's bigger. Lockheed has to move to a whole new, bigger facility. The bureaucracy grows a little bit. And it's not to say that the Skunk Works of today still doesn't do amazing things. I mean, they built the F-35. Uh,
Mhm.
but that kind of like, we're gonna do it in a warehouse in Burbank, and no one's gonna know about it,
The
and
scrappiness.
that's lost, right? And the F-117 was the last, but it's like an incredible last chapter because that plane, huge leap from the A-12.
We've talked so much about, deservedly so, about Kelly Johnson and his professional career. Probably don't have time to get into his personal life. He had 3 wives, two of whom died. He loved his ranch. He had so many he tried to get there as much as possible to relax and refresh. But give us just a list and then talk for a minute about his final years. Kelly
So he
Johnson's accolades, because he won or
everything.
received or was awarded everything.
Yeah, Presidential Medal of Freedom, 2 Collier Awards, which was given to it's the highest award in aviation design. He said, according to his last wife, he claimed that the one that meant the most to him was the Guggenheim Award because it's an award for art and design. All the others were basically engineering awards or national security awards or patriot. Thank you for like recognition of your what you've done for your country. The Guggenheim, because he really mattered to him that these things look great. He really cared. Yes, he was not going to change the design of the A-12 to make it more beautiful, but he was able to make it in a way that it was beautiful. And I think that's what bothered him so much about the F-117. He's like, that thing is so ugly. but he did care. And I think, I'm glad you mentioned, you don't have time to get into it, but he didn't work all the time. He did have this huge ranch out near Reagan's Ranch near Santa Barbara. He liked to ride horses. He did cattle drives, and he was quickly the funny story about his 3 wives is that I like to say that he like engineered his personal life the way he engineered his business life, which was his first wife picked out his second wife. She basically said, we can never know exactly how it went down, but my theory is she was kind of like, Kelly, you need somebody at home. Like you're like way too busy, and I don't think it's good for you to come home to an empty. So I'm going to pick your wife. And so he basically told her to marry his assistant, and he did. And then when she got married, when she died, or when she was getting sick and looking like she was going to die, it was important to her also that he's already kind of lined up wife number 3. Now it wasn't immediate, but it was within a couple months. He was married, I think, for the 3rd time. And then that wife outlived him, and he spent his last days, last 2 years actually, sadly, in a hospital with dementia. Nancy, his 3rd wife, was by his side the whole time. He only left the hospital one time, and that was to go out when the Blackbird was retired, the SR-71 program was retired. The very last flight of the very last Blackbird came into Burbank, if you can imagine this, because he dies in 1990. This is probably 89. By 1989, Burbank is like a big part of LA, like malls and corporations. And so a Blackbird hits the afterburners, makes 3 passes over Burbank, and then lands and is retired. And they got Kelly out of the hospital. Ben Rich and his wife put him in a limo, a black car, parked next to the runway, and he got to watch the Blackbird. And as Ben was a colorful storyteller. As he tells it, like a tear trickled down his cheek, like Kelly was moved by the experience. Then he goes back to the hospital and never gets out again. Buried today in Forest Lawn Cemetery, which is in Burbank. Beautiful spot on a hill that he chose himself, overlooking the valley where he made his mark.
Now, is that the flight where the SR-71 went from like St. Louis to Cincinnati in 8 minutes or something ridiculous?
Yeah, I think they broke And then when they delivered it to Air and Space, they broke the cross country's record again. So that thing, I mean, yeah, it could fly LA to New York in an hour. I mean, every time that thing flew, it basically broke a record. And it was when it had to turn, it took like several states to turn because it was going
Yeah, that's
Mach
a
3.
that was one of the things. I'm glad you mentioned that because it took 120 miles to turn around or something.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, because it Mach 3, you can imagine how much it's faster than a rifle bullet. And it was, yeah, like, so it took like 120 miles. It basically was like crossing state lines to make a turn. But you can also imagine that's why it was invulnerable to missiles. The missiles could not fly fast enough to hit it.
Not a single one got shot down.
Nope. There were some crashes. I mean, a couple were destroyed in testing. Only one on a quote unquote operational mission, but it was flying back to the U.S. They don't know what happened to it. It wasn't shot down. It just crashed.
Should note on the cover of Josh Dean's book, there's a silhouette of an SR-71, just in case you want to know which his favorite plane actually is. We've reached the point on the Leaders and Legends podcast where we ask the same 5 questions of all of our guests. Mr. Dean, are you ready?
Okay.
What was your first job?
I bagged groceries at Kroger, which is a grocery store, and I was living in West Virginia at the time.
What was your first concert?
I believe it was a band called Living Color in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
Awesome. We've not had to live in color. Oh yeah, Vernon Reed, phenomenal group. If you could suggest any book for someone to read, which book would you recommend?
Oh, wow. That is a hard one. God, it changes all the time. I'm going to say today, like anyone who reads my book, I love Ben Rich's Skunk Works book a lot too. I mean, I know it's thematically the same, but otherwise it's going to be too hard for me to think of one.
Number 4, if you could witness any event in history, be there in person as it happens, which event would you choose? This is always tough for history geeks.
Yeah, man. I mean, first manned space flight, maybe. I feel like that would at the time would have seemed so mind blowing. I mean, I got to imagine witnessing the first flight of the Blackbird would have been. Actually, you know what? I kind of it's been described to me what it was like when they fired the engines up on the Blackbird. I wish I could have seen that or actually heard it. I think it's a visceral experience.
Heard it. To your point in your book, the volume was incomprehensible. But of course, I've seen Ted Nugent in concert, so that's probably the closest I've ever come.
I've been to a drag race. So I've heard it's like essentially having 2 drag racers revving their engines next to you. Like your whole body is just like every cell is vibrating.
The last question. If you could have dinner with anyone living today, 2 hours off the record, 2 hours off the record just to chat, whom would you choose?
Oh, these are hard questions. I didn't prepare for these. No one told me there'd be homework. I know they're not supposed to be.
Kelly Johnson would not want you to have gotten the questions ahead of time.
It is true. Wow. Who's still alive? I'm trying to think of who's still alive. I'm now at an age where people,
I'll tell you the most popular response is Barack Obama.
I almost said that, but I felt like that was too cliched. Like that was an idea that popped into my head, but I was like, that's what probably a lot of people say. I do admire that man. I think that would be fascinating.
Tell you all about the Bin Laden raid.
Yeah. Oh, I know. Although, of course, there've been a bunch of books read. I feel like I know as much about it as I.
Leon Panetta came on the podcast and he talked a little bit about it because I think he was head of the CIA at the time, Secretary of Defense, one of the two.
I was trying not to say, yeah, and then there's like athletes, too many athletes to name, but I think Obama was the name that popped into my head. I was just trying to think of something more like sneaky, like something that people wouldn't have said. What's the most surprising answer you've ever gotten?
So many of them are, they're obviously celebrities. Some people have chosen like their brother or their dad, which is obviously fine. Surprisingly, Sofia Vergara has never been chosen, which I think is a colossal error. But they're mostly figures of history. George W. Bush is popular. President Trump is popular. I'd have to say the other one who gets a lot of, and this will be I think yours is my 374th podcast.
Wow.
The other one who gets a lot of mentions is Paul McCartney.
Yeah, that's a pretty good answer too. And I should say, yeah, you mentioned dads and brothers. I realized earlier when you asked me that Indiana question, I didn't say my dad's name. His name was David Dean. He went to Wabash, so he's an Indiana guy through and through.
Oh, we've had a lot of Wabash grads on this podcast, a lot, including the current governor, Mike Braun. But Wabash is a phenomenal place. You have been listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise. We are also a federally certified, veteran-owned small business, registered with the state of Indiana and the city of Indianapolis. As always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister, who, besides being one of our city in Indianapolis and our state's greatest citizens, was part of the Army Air Corps and used to go to lunch with me with a P-38 pin on his lapel. Our guest, Josh Dean, author of The Impossible Factory, the remarkable true story of Kelly Johnson and the Lockheed Skunk Works, America's innovation machine. As I said before, Mr. Dean, I was hesitant to read the book because I wasn't sure I could understand it or would understand it. Your writing and your descriptions of the people and the machines and the technology makes it eminently readable. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me. It was fun.
Thank you very much for listening to Leaders and Legends, brought to you by Veteran Strategies Incorporated. If you want to contact us about this program or our menu of public relations services, please send us an email at robert@veteranstrategies.com. That's robert@veteranstrategies.com.